Sharon Gaffney has been following proceedings at the courtroom here in Paris. She joins us now. Sharon, it seems like we're coming to the end of a trial that's been marred by setbacks. Can you bring us up to speed today?
Yes, well, Olivia, the 14 defendants are charged, as you say, to varying degrees with procuring weapons and also providing logistical support for the coordinated attacks that shook Paris over 3 days back in January 2015. Now, one of the accused is also charged with complicity in those attacks. 3 of them are actually being charged in absentia, and it's understood that at least 2 of the accused may have been killed in Syria. As you say, the 3 gunmen, they were killed by security forces on January 9th, 2015. Now, the trial was due to get underway initially back in the spring, but it was put back because France went into lockdown in connection with COVID-19. It began back on the 2nd of September, but it was delayed again when the main suspect, the man who's described as the main suspect, Ali Reza Polat, was tested positive for COVID-19. Now, there are 200 civil parties involved in this case. There are dozens of lawyers. And the survivors and also the families of some of those who were killed in the attacks, they've been attending court here. Some of them gave dignified and emotional testimony in the early days of the trial. We heard from one man, for instance, who was shot and injured at the attack at the Charlie Hebdo offices, and he told the court that he felt lucky that he'd only been partially paralysed when he was shot by the gunmen. Also, the current editor of the Charlie Hebdo magazine, he spoke of having to step over the bodies of his friends and colleagues, and also of his later distress. He was torn, he said, between the necessity of continuing to publish the magazine, but also his grief and his distress at what had happened. We also heard from people who had survived the attack at the kosher supermarket east of Paris. One witness, a cashier who'd been working in the store, said that she had been fired at by the gunman who entered the supermarket. The bullet missed her just by millimetres, but she said the gunman turned to her and shouted at her and said, "You represent 2 of the things that I hate most in the world, French people and Jewish people." So it's been an emotional trial for all of the parties involved. These 14 people, if they are convicted, sentences will be handed down, as you say, later on today. We're expecting the verdicts in a couple of hours' time. The prosecutors have called for sentences of between 5 years and life imprisonment if these people are convicted.
Indeed, this has been a trial of some very powerful witness accounts in the courtroom. And in their summing up statements on Mondays, I believe lawyers for the defence reminded the judge that it was those men on trial and not terrorism itself. How much do you think the symbolism of this case is going to weigh on that sentencing?
Well, if we think back to the attacks almost 6 years ago, there really were incidents that shook France, and not just France, just internationally also, focused really attention on the threat posed by jihadists. And within a couple of days of the attacks, you may remember 2 million people had gathered in Paris, including 40 world leaders, to express their solidarity with the victims and also with the French state. But these attacks, they weren't just seen as an attack on France and its values. They were seen here in France and internationally really as an attack on the freedom of expression, the freedom of thought, and just underscoring the historical significance of these proceedings. It's the first terrorism trial that's been filmed here in France under legislation that was introduced back in the 1980s. And making that decision to film the trial for the National Archives, the president of the Paris Court of Appeal said that the attacks back in January 2015, he said that they profoundly marked the history of terrorism, not just nationally, but internationally. As I said, the verdicts, if these 14 people are convicted, will be handed down in about 2 hours' time.
Thank you very much, Sharon Gaffney there, reporting for us from the courtroom in Paris.